In 2007, Danny Ainge, the then GM of the Boston Celtics, set into motion a domino effect that he did not foresee by trading for Kevin Garnett and Ray Allen, forming a big three alongside Paul Pierce in Boston. Ever since this day in the NBA, many franchises have strived to do something similar. The formula may have been different each time, but the end goal was always the same: get as much talent on the roster as possible. While super teams have existed before, they became more relevant than ever following the Big Three's formation, and they have had their fair share of success.
Anything's possible!
It's back-to-back titles for the Heat.
The Golden State Warriors champions once again, back-to-back titles, 3 and 4 years.
But the reality is, the teams we often label super don't end up looking that way in practice. In fact, lately in the NBA, ever since Kevin Durant's departure from Golden State, every single attempt at forming a super team has utterly failed. But why is that? What changed since 2007 that has made 3 All-Stars on the same team seem so much less threatening? And is the reign of super teams over in the NBA? Welcome to NBA Deep Dive. Thank you to the sponsor of this video, Fabletics. This month's haul is all about summer and fall, and when I unboxed it, I was reminded why I love partnering with Fabletics so much. Their quality is obvious from the moment that I hold any of their products, and when I wear Fabletics, I feel the comfort and support that comes with long-lasting, well-fitting clothes, as their moisture-wicking, anti-odor, and 4-way stretch technologies keep me feeling fresh. Plus, their monthly drops keep my closet stocked with stylish, functional fits from casual to active wear. If that sounds like it's for you, then go to fabletics.com/rusty and become a VIP to get access to exclusives like up to 50% off of all products all day, every day, early access to styles, and free access to the Fabletics Fit app. And when you use my link, fabletics.com/rusty, then you get awesome offers that are just for new VIPs, like 2 for $19 shorts and 70% off of your first purchase. As a VIP, you can use your member credit to redeem a 2-piece set or any product up to $100 every single month. And if you want to skip a month, you can do so as often as you would like and you won't be charged. Just skip between the 1st and the 5th of the month. So to tap in, become a VIP, get some of the best clothes in the game, and 70% off of your first purchase, check out the link in the description or go to fabletics.com/rusty. Again, that's fabletics.com/rusty, and thank you to Fabletics for sponsoring this video. In order to understand the rise and fall of super teams, we first need to understand what a super team actually is, because that's something that has been up for debate ever since the term came into existence. The majority of discourse as it relates to super teams is about whether or not the teams we are labeling to be super teams are actually, in fact, super teams. I'm going to be saying the word super team a lot in this video, so hopefully it doesn't lose all meaning to you by the end of this. Some teams are fairly obviously super, like in the case of the 2017 Warriors. In some other cases, however, well, you get Derrick Rose saying that it's us and the Warriors as the super teams. Yeah, no. Unfortunately, because of how contentious this conversation is, there just simply is no way that I or anyone else could come up with a definition that satisfies everyone. So I'm just going to use my own definition and hope that it's acceptable enough that we can keep on chugging. To me, a super team first and foremost consists of at least 2.5 superstars, or at the very least, 1 superstar and someone very, very close to being in that tier. And as for the 0.5 thing, obviously there's no such thing as a half person, so that 0.5 represents a certain amount of talent, and there's a few ways that it can be distributed. The most obvious one is if you just round up, call it a 3rd superstar, and then you have a big 3. Even if the 3rd guy isn't a bona fide superstar and instead is just a borderline one, or even your run-of-the-mill all-star, it usually ends up being discussed as a big 3 nonetheless. But that first 2 superstar requirement is damn near non-negotiable for me. So this immediately raises yet another question. What exactly is a superstar? Now that's a question that deserves a deep dive of its own, but bring out your neck braces, everyone, because we're about to do a shallow dive. A superstar, again, by my own definition, is a player capable of being the best player on a championship team. And just to be clear, to be in the aforementioned borderline superstar tier, said player needs to be in or around a top 10 player in the league conversations. That yet again comes with its own set of blurred lines, because a lot of players are called superstars who have yet to achieve being the best player on a title team. But generally speaking, you can look at players who seem like superstars but just haven't won a ring yet and go ahead and call a spade a spade. When teams face off versus a contender, they almost always have to worry about just one guy being so good that they can carry their team to a title. But when teams have to deal with two of those guys, it starts to feel less and less possible to win, or downright impossible, period. Being a superstar player comes with a ton of burdens. Usually the best case scenario for a superstar is being given enough supporting talent that those burdens that they're obligated to carry weigh a lot less. So, if you can put yet another superstar next to that original superstar, well, now those burdens are distributed amongst two individuals rather than one, which also makes the responsibilities of the rest of the team easier to fulfill as well. So for any team in consideration for being super, if they do not have two best player on championship team level guys, or at the very least, one of them plus a guy on those margins, then I don't count them as a super team. The 2017 Knicks, for example, weren't a super team, in case you were curious. I wouldn't even say a team like the 2024 champion Boston Celtics are a super team. Though he walked away with Finals MVP, I wouldn't call Jaylen Brown a superstar. Winning that award does not give you that title by default, i.e. Andre Iguodala. I definitely underrated JB in the past. Hell, I probably still do to some extent now, but if we're taking it as far as calling the guy a superstar, well, I just can't meet you there. He's very good, but he's not nearing top 10 conversations in a semi-unanimous way. Jason Tatum, on the other hand, is a superstar. Even though sometimes he doesn't always feel like one, he's still undeniably the best player on a championship team nonetheless. But after that, Jalen is a star. A damn good one, but that's all. He's just not a borderline superstar like what is necessary for the Celtics to be labeled a super team. But the definition doesn't start and stop at having two superstar level players. We still have to address that point 5, not just because of my own arbitrary definition, but also because there have been some teams in the past that had just two superstars, but were not really super teams in my view, and generally were not considered that by a majority of NBA fans either. And I think the reason for that is the word team in super team. If your whole deal with your roster is wholly based on two individuals, well, that's a duo, not a team. I don't believe the Kobe and Shaq Lakers were a super team. They were two superstars and a few capable role players, but nobody special after those two. When you look up lists of super teams, the peak Kobe and Shaq Lakers never come up. Only the 04 roster with two ex-stars at the end of their careers tacked on. So going beyond your top two guys, I think that's where things start to get a little bit more debatable. There are a couple of diverging paths here. One is the route of having an abundance of star players, not a third superstar, but genuine all-star tier players, or at least a phenomenal cast of role players who can match the production of an all-star. The 2017 Warriors are going to be used as an example a lot because I think they're the super team to eclipse all super teams, which is ironic because they also appear to be potentially the last one. But after Curry and KD, who were two obvious superstars, they then had Klay Thompson and Draymond Green, and Andre Iguodala, who I guess technically made an all-star game 2 years prior to joining Golden State. Klay was a 20-point per game scorer, one of the 4 best shooters ever, and a great perimeter defender, and Draymond was one of, if not the best defender in the NBA, winning DPOY in 2017. Another path is one that's surprisingly more rare, with really the best example being the first three-peat era Chicago Bulls, where the team had one superstar, one borderline superstar, and a kick-ass group of role players. Michael Jordan, of course, is the epitome of what a superstar is. I don't think I need to elaborate on that any further. Now, as for Scottie Pippen, while I will contest the legitimacy of him actually being a bona fide quote-unquote superstar, there is no doubt in my mind that he was quite close, and that many do consider him to be a superstar undoubtedly, unlike myself, especially in the context of his era where he was at least borderline top 10 and is often dubbed the best perimeter defender of his era, maybe even ever. He is the epitome of a borderline superstar nearly to the same degree that MJ is the epitome of a superstar. So Scottie and MJ paired with Horace Grant and Bill Cartwright down low, plus two great jump shooting guards in John Paxson and BJ Armstrong, made for a super team, albeit not an overt one because, again, Scottie is borderline, whereas, again, a guy like Jaylen Brown is just not. But the first three-peat Bulls are indeed a super team nonetheless. There's actually a third path, although I don't think it's one that we have seen in a very, very long time, that being when you just have it all. The 1960s Celtics had 3 All-Stars more often than not, one of which was arguably the GOAT of his era, Bill motherfucking Russell, all while having a deep supporting cast. The Showtime Lakers for the first 2 to 3 seasons of Magic's career when Kareem was still a superstar tier player also had Jamal Wilkes as a great third star, as well as role players like Norm Nixon, Michael Cooper, and Jim Chones. Other than that, you're pretty much always going with one of the other two paths because, of course, having a roster just insanely stacked is the rarest path. It's ridiculously hard to get tons of talent. That's what makes the super team novel to begin with. So, to summarize my definition of what makes up the anatomy of a super team, it has 2 superstars, or at least one and a borderline superstar, and good help beyond those 2 on the rest of the roster, whether that be from another borderline superstar or bona fide all-star to form a big 3, or an all-star cast of role players. I do not believe a team with 1 superstar and 2 to 3 all-stars, or a team with 3 to 4 all-stars but no superstar, is a super team. For example, take the Spurs when they had 3 all-stars in Tim Duncan, Manu Ginobili, and Tony Parker. They were not a super team. Tim was a superstar, but neither Manu nor Tony were ever in those conversations. Then there's the team that was called the Spurs of the East, the 2015 Atlanta Hawks. They had 4 all-stars, but no superstar, and therefore, they were not a super team. You may have noticed that I didn't use any examples of non-champion super teams yet, and that's because that's where things once again start to get pretty murky. And we'll get into those waters later on in this video, but before that, let's talk about the concept of a super team wasn't anything new when the term really gained traction in the 2000s. Using our personal definition of a super team, we could say they began all the way back in the 60s, with the Celtics inarguably being a super team. You don't quite get that many Hall of Famers nor that many titles without being one. Then with the influx of talent from the ABA merger, the 80s saw a spike in talented rosters, with some truly loaded teams that we might call super in retrospect. But the first super teams as we know them really saw their infancy start in the 90s. Like I said, we could classify the first three-peat Bulls to be a super team, but what I didn't say was that the reason I specified the first three-peat is because Scottie Pippen was a notably worse player for the second three-peat. Not that those Bulls rosters weren't excellent, just not quite super team level, which is why they looked a whole lot more beatable the second time around, even if they still ended up three-peating again. Scottie went on to be a part of a Big Three after his Bulls tenure, joining Charles Barkley and Hakeem Olajuwon in Houston. And this is where super team discourse in the modern context started to exist. Like, at all.
Now the Rockets are taking a run at another title, and they've got a 6-time champion on their side. Former Bulls Scottie Pippen has now joined Olajuwon and Charles Barkley on a front line that features 3 of the 50 greatest players in NBA history.
But the real super team discourse started in the offseason in 2007.
4 on the clock, 3 on the clock. Pierce for the game. Got it!
Back to Kevin on the roll. Oh, good pass.
Picked off by Pierce. Ray Allen for the game. Got it!
Basket.
Oh, KG.
On Rondo. Allen. Over Noah. Oh! Ray Allen has done it again! Inside. Backs it in. Foul. Pierce puts it up for the win. Knocks it down. Celtics win.
In the summer of 07, Danny Ainge, the then GM of the Celtics, pulled off a masterclass in the art of NBA GMing, landing all-star Ray Allen from Seattle and superstar Kevin Garnett from Minnesota, pairing them both with a superstar of their own, Paul Pierce. These three combined made for a terrifying force, and from the moment the roster was assembled, they were labeled a super team. Now, unfortunately, these three only managed to pull off a single championship run. People love to make fun of this team in retrospect because of the fact that they only got one, but seem to talk about it as though they were a dynasty or something. But the reality is, Kevin Garnett got hurt before the 2009 playoffs began, which significantly hindered Boston's chances as he was arguably their best player. Oh, God. Too much Celtics praise. Even still, despite only hanging just one banner, the Celtics were the perfect super team. On the court, all of their skill sets were complementary. The three of them were so talented on offense that defenses focusing on any one of them just opened the game up for the other two. The three basically averaged the same number of shots per game in their first season together. Off of the court, as in, in a narrative sense, this group of players needed each other more than maybe any other trio in NBA history, as all three were basically losers up to this point in their careers, with all of them only making it to the conference finals just once in their careers, and failing to make the playoffs for consecutive recent seasons. Ray Allen's peak as a first option was losing in a controversial conference finals to the Sixers in 2001. Aside from that one playoff run, Ray never made it past round 2 again in Seattle and missed the playoffs 7 out of his 11 seasons before coming to Boston. KG made the conference finals in 2004, but otherwise it was disappointment after disappointment, losing in the first round every year prior to 04 and missing the playoffs altogether every year following it. And the Truth's first conference finals appearance was actually in his first ever playoff run, but he failed to make it that far again until Boston's Big Three came together, even missing the playoffs in 06 and 07 just like KG and Ray Allen. But in the 08 playoffs, all of these great players who had spent far too long burdened by garbage supporting casts finally had the chance to prove themselves to be the winners they knew they were, united as the NBA's most powerful trio. This did require some sacrifice, though. All three saw a sizable decline in their box score numbers, most notably Ray Allen, who went from a dynamic 3-level scorer to primarily an off-ball 3-point threat. KG carried less of the load of Boston's offense than he did in Minnesota, focusing his energy on defense and winning DPOY in the process. And Pierce took a more passive role as a scorer, saving his attack for later in the game, something he previously couldn't afford to do because his team would put them in too deep of a hole to climb out of. The Celtics started a new meta. They upped the ante for what a team was even capable of being. So naturally, the only way to match this would be to up the ante even further.
The answer to the question everybody wants to know. LeBron, what's your decision?
In this fall, man, it's very tough. In this fall, I'm going to take my talents to South Beach and join the Miami Heat.
Miami Heat.
In it, launch to LeBron, up and in, they've done it again.
With the rebound for Haslem, he goes long, and LeBron makes an incredible play.
Swatted away from behind. Wade kicks it out to Bosh, throws it down.
James lobs to Wade, back to James.
Jumps for Durant.
Oh, Wade, what a play!
3 seconds left. Lillard tries in. Blocked by Bosh. Ball game's over.
That's a three.
the summer of 2010, LeBron James teamed up with his bestest buddy there ever was, Dwayne Wade, and Chris Bosh, to form a Big Three in Miami. This team looked even scarier than that of the Celtics. LeBron James was a much better player than either KG or Pierce, Wade was still a superstar at this point, and Chris Bosh couldn't have made for a better third star. The roster was so unbelievably talented that LeBron famously felt so confident, he said they would win not 4, not 5, not 6, not 7, you know the line by now. While they wouldn't quite live up to those heights, the Big Three Heat certainly left their stamp in the NBA history book. A theme you'll see in this video quite a bit is the concept of fit. While it was very hand in glove for the Celtics, the fit between Miami superstars, on the other hand, was a little bit more awkward at first. Unfortunately for LeBron, he was the one joining the Heat, as his bestest buddy ever, Dwayne Wade, had won a title for Miami in 2006, so it really felt like it was his franchise. So as a result, LeBron didn't want to just outright steal the keys to his friend's franchise. And his hesitancy to do that cost them big time in 2011.
And the celebration will begin. The Dallas Mavericks are NBA champions. The first title in franchise history. Meanwhile, you see for the Miami Heat a stunning ending to one of the more compelling seasons in NBA history. A bitter finish to a year that was really a championship or failure, according to most people, including the Miami Heat players.
Beyond just the pecking order, these two also had some overlapping skill sets, and neither were necessarily known for how good they were without the ball in their hands. So in order to maximize their fit, both would have to adapt, and adapt they did, as both would improve a ton as cutters. LeBron would often be a screener for Wade, and they had Hall of Fame synergy on the fast break. LeBron would even develop his three ball, having a career year from outside in 2013. Once James became the clear-cut number one and both figured out how to play off of each other, the sky was the limit. But they weren't the only ones who had to adapt. Chris Bosh's arc in Miami unknowingly started many aspects of the basketball evolution we know and love or hate today. His development from a power forward with a deadly mid-range game to a center who stretched the floor all the way out to the three-point line was far ahead of its time. He was great at catching and shooting, he made quick decisions in the post so the ball was almost always in the hands of Wade or Bron, and he was their defensive anchor, being able to put more of his energy into that side of the ball now that he was the third option instead of the first. If you want to know more about Chris Bosh and how he contributed to this evolution, then of course you can watch our The Death of the Power Forward and Who's Next video. But despite all of this growth together, I would really only say this team was a super team for their first 2 years. See, after 2012, Dwayne Wade started to decline rather significantly due to injury. They blew it in 2011, so their only real championship as a super team came against the OKC Thunder in 2012. In 2013, Wade was still quite good, Bosh of course was still great, my little Pookie Bear, and they even added an aging Ray Allen to the team. And luckily, LeBron James was peaking at this point, which is saying a lot, so they still managed to get one over on the Spurs as a result. But that didn't happen in 2014, which led to LeBron returning home to Cleveland, trying to form a super team of his own. Though I don't think they quite met that mark, but they got close enough with a very solid big three. Kyrie Irving was a little too far from a superstar, and Kevin Love wasn't there either, and was a little too shit in the playoffs, frankly, especially the 2016 finals, but Love did manage to get a very important stop in Game 7. He might not have been able to contribute to a super team by being on one, but with this single stop and the preceding finals upset victory, he set into motion the creation of the super team to end all super teams. Oh man. It always comes back to Kevin Durant, doesn't it? I gave my 2 cents about this particular decision from Kevin in my Kevin Durant Hater Manifesto video, but I never actually talked about this roster itself. The best player on the team, Stephen Curry, was now getting a better sidekick than he ever could have hoped for. The Warriors seemed god-tier unfair already as they dominated the 2016 regular season following their first title in 2015, literally winning more regular season games than ever before, and likely more than we'll ever see again. But the Cavs proved them to be mere mortals, mounting the only 3-1 comeback in NBA Finals history. However, it just so happened that in the Western Conference Finals beforehand, the Warriors eliminated the Thunder in a 3-1 comeback of their own, sending home the superstar who would be the final piece to Golden State's super team puzzle just weeks later that same summer. The 2016 offseason featured a huge spike in salary cap, meaning that despite having 3 All-Stars and a handful of role players, the Warriors had a max spot ready to give to anybody, and they managed to get the best player available. It was hard enough to defend Steph and Klay on the perimeter, then you're adding Kevin Durant to the equation. Now, he might not be as deadly of a three-point shooter, but he's still very much worthy of the defense's attention. Like, what are you supposed to do against this?
Winning that tip. Curry on the go. This is game 1, Western Conference semifinals. As Curry does his magic, gets back over and scores. Late corner 3.
Walker is zipping ahead to the rim, and Durant throws it back emphatically. Now Curry shakes 3 and connects.
In the backcourt.
Finds Vonleh. Blocked by Green.
Incredible opportunity. Durant for 3. It's good. Kevin Durant from downtown. And Golden State.
They are the best team that ever graced the NBA. It's not close. I'm sorry to the 2001 Lakers, the 96 Bulls, really the 93 Bulls because they were better, don't at me. I'm sorry to the 86 Celtics, the Showtime Lakers, and Bill and Red Celtics, but I don't think this is even a conversation. A 73-win team added a top 3 player in the league when they already had a top 3 player to begin with, all while they had 2 more top 20 players in Klay Thompson and Defensive Player of the Year Draymond Green. It's so fucking insane that this team even existed. So insane that they were declared to be the champions that year before Durant even held up his jersey in the press conference. They would lose just 1 game in the 2017 playoffs, and beyond a tough 2018 conference finals versus Houston, they dominated those playoffs as well. If not for his Achilles tear, it's all but certain that this team would have three-peated. The Warriors with KD was the superest of super teams, and as a result, the peak of NBA teams in general. However, peaks don't necessarily mean what follows needs to be a dramatic fall-off, but that's exactly what we got. While a few title teams did get somewhat close to that super team label, there has yet to be another successful super team since Golden State. And as we discussed in our most recent video about the decline of the finals, the new meta in the NBA seems to be as far from the super team meta as it could be, especially being just a few years removed from it. Every year now, we seem to pick some team that we want to label to be a super team, and then they just aren't. Why is that? Let's detour from my own editorializing of this topic and go straight to where the facts are, the internet's most reliable source, Wikipedia. When you look at the super teams in the NBA wiki page, there are 16 teams listed, with each given a lifespan and a preview of their main characters. Now, I'm not going to sit here and read it to you, this isn't that kind of YouTube channel. Instead, Rudy took the liberty of summarizing it in a spreadsheet, and maybe making a graphic for us, we'll see. So, according to the Wikipedia definition of a super team, after the Chicago Bulls had their last run, there have been just 4 successful super teams. The 3 we've already labeled the same way, plus those 2016 Cavs that I don't personally count. But hey, whatever. J.R. Smith is cool enough, so I'll let it slide. Meanwhile, there's been 6 notable failed super teams. And the one and only team under current super teams are the Phoenix Suns. But the modern pattern of failed super teams started with the 90s Rockets. Following their back-to-back run in 94 and 95, Hakeem and Drexler were both reaching their mid-30s, so they said, hey, what could fix this? Perhaps another aging superstar. So they went and got Charles Barkley, who was still quite effective in his first year there, averaging 18 points, 13.5 rebounds, and nearly 5 assists. He helped them win 9 more games than the previous season, but they would lose to the Utah Jazz in the conference finals. In the following year, the round mound of rebound started to look more like the round mound of less rebounds. Clyde Drexler and Hakeem were also declining, so they went 41-41 and lost in round 1 to yet again the Jazz. In the offseason, Drexler retired, but Houston made one last desperate push, trading for Scottie Pippen following the breakup of the Bulls dynasty. But despite helping make them a top 10 team in the NBA, Scottie didn't have great chemistry with the rest of the roster. He really didn't want to be in Houston, and he left the following season after losing to a Lakers team on the brink of a dynasty. Barkley and Hakeem both declined dramatically and got major injuries in the following season, where they were 36 and 37 years old respectively, effectively ending this retirement home era in Houston. So sticking to the wiki point of view, we can see that before these Rockets, super teams were 5 for 5 on getting a championship eventually. But since the turn of the millennia, there's been more notable failures than successes. For the first 50 years of the NBA or so, a super team was basically guaranteeing at least one ring. But for the last 25 years, it's more likely that you'll fail than not. With all of these high-profile names coming together on one roster, and then failing to win a championship, what was previously an undeniable truth that super team equals championship, that was now broken. Fast forward to 2003. The Lakers had fallen short of a title for the first time in 3 years, so they decided to beef up the roster by signing EDP and Gary Payton. Both were older and out of their primes, but still quite capable of contributing, as each of them were 20-point-per-game scorers on playoff teams the season prior to joining the Lakers. The roster no doubt improved with these additions, winning 6 more games in the regular season and making the finals rather than losing in round 2 and getting embarrassed by Tim Duncan in the process, but these two were jumping onto a sinking ship. They might have scooped out some water here or there, but there was no fixing the Kobe and Shaq relationship at this point. And Jerry Sandusky over here decided to scoop some water back in by flirting with Kobe's wife. Truly a class act, that ringless bitch is. Fast forward another decade and we get 2 failed super teams in back-to-back years. There was yet another failed super team in LA surrounding Kobe that was trying to rekindle the recent success that they had lost, as after repeating in 2009 and 2010, the Lakers were swept in a series that they were favored in versus Dallas. And in 2012, they started to look old and irrelevant thanks to a gentleman's sweep by the up-and-coming OKC Thunder. The only bright spot for them was their young big man Andrew Bynum, who was always a good finisher, rebounder, and defender, but he had started to break out as a scorer, even making the All-Star team and All-NBA second team in 2012 after averaging 19, 12, and 2 blocks. Don't freak out too much about that All-NBA second team thing, because remember, in this era, just about any center that wasn't Dwight Howard was a joke. So that's exactly who LA looked to when it was time for an upgrade, sending Bynum to Philly in a 4-team deal that sent Andre Iguodala to Denver, a whole bunch of stuff to Orlando, and Dwight Howard to LA. Now, in case you forgot, because it seems many have, including the dumbasses making the NBA Top 75 list, at the time of the trade, this is who Dwight Howard was.
Howard spins the ball, throws it down. Spin left, throws it in the face of the game. Bang trying to blow in, blocked by Howard. Howard at the buzzer! Nelson escaping Holiday, the lob for Howard. Oh, wow!
I guess maybe they do. Look at that. That's no goal.
All blocked by Howard. What a lob to third and lost the game. Durant blocked by Howard.
Unfortunately, however, he wasn't quite the same in LA, as he had to play with a back injury throughout the year. Something else that I think contributed to this failure that is seldom mentioned is the spacing issues. Dwight Howard was super dominant on offense on top of his defense in Orlando because he had 4 shooters around him basically at all times. Jameer Nelson, Rashard Lewis, and Hedo Turkoglu were all high-volume, lights-out shooters, and the 2 guard would be one of either Courtney Lee, Michael Petrus, or JJ Redick, who all ranged from good to, in the case of JJ, all-time great shooters. Honestly, this Stan Van Gundy squad deserves some serious credit for ushering in the three-point era. In LA, Dwight had to share the floor with Pau Gasol, who never shot threes. Kobe, while capable of shooting threes, wasn't a super high volume guy, and in 2013 in particular, he shot just 32% from outside. Metta World Peace was just okay from 3, and while Steve Nash was an all-time great shooter, he played just 50 games and took just 2 3-pointers a night. They actually had some pretty good shooting off of the bench, so it wasn't as bad as it could have been, but ultimately it wasn't nearly as good as what worked in the past. Kobe also just didn't like Dwight, and he didn't do much to hide that. The roster ended up being the textbook example of good on paper but bad in practice. The result of this was a 34-year-old Kobe attempting to carry the team through all of this turmoil in the hopes that they could put it together in the playoffs. But then he tore his Achilles, ending LA's season and his career all in one go. I honestly feel bad for Dwight because, mostly to no fault of his own, his biggest blunder as a player happened when the lights were at their brightest. For many, this is how he is remembered. It's really not fair at all. But the year following this flop from LA was perhaps the funniest failed super team ever. Though many contenders are coming up to be sure, the Brooklyn Nets, after getting new ownership in 2013, made what is perhaps the worst trade in the history of this sport. As Brooklyn traded multiple first-round picks in exchange for a very old Paul Pierce, KG, and Jason Terry. One thing about Danny Ainge is he is pretty ruthless as a GM. He saw the writing on the wall with this core, and he was happy to send them to a team that couldn't see that very same writing. Pierce and KG would be joining 3 other All-Stars in Brooklyn: Darren Williams, Joe Johnson, and Brooke Lopez. So if this was like an everybody in their primes type of situation, it would have actually been pretty fucking sick, but they weren't. As a result, they lost in round 2 to the Big 3 Heat, and in the year following, losing in round 1 versus the Nate Robinson and Joakim Noah-led Chicago Bulls. Now we're starting to move into more familiar territory, as the last 7 seasons of NBA history have featured a comical amount of failed super teams for a short stretch of time. The 2018 OKC Thunder, the 2022 Lakers, oh hey, the Nets are making this mistake twice, and the Phoenix Suns this previous season in 2024. Going down the list, OKC paired Russell Westbrook with another superstar in Paul George, the perfect complementary piece. But that's not all. They also traded for an aging Carmelo Anthony, who still had decent stats on a terrible Knicks team, and turns out, shock of all shocks, those stats were as empty as Elon Musk's head. Melo's play style wasn't complimentary at all. He was a ball stopper, shot incredibly inefficiently, and brought nothing to the table as a defender or playmaker. Just an inefficient 16 points a game, all while making a fuss to the media about refusing to come off of the bench. Russ and PG was a good duo, and the Thunder had a few good role players, but Melo just fucked it all up. They looked much better the year following it with Melo gone, but only finished 1 game better because Paul George got hurt and played through it. Of course, this meant lowered production, and they'd go about 500 during the 20 or so games that he was hurt. But again, they otherwise looked like a much better team simply by removing Carmelo. The Western Conference is just a fucking bloodbath. The 2022 Lakers made a trade that is baffling in hindsight, but had some degree of sense to it at the time. The logic of trading for Russell Westbrook was that LeBron and AD get hurt all the time and are asked to do too much. So if you put some of that burden onto Russ, it makes their lives easier. Unfortunately, while that made sense at a glance, it doesn't when you are actually critical. Especially with AD playing the 4 so often with a non-spacing 5, there would often be 3 non-3-point shooters on the floor. Russ was such a horrible fit next to Bron and AD that LeBron ended up being their best 3-point shooter, and though he has been better in recent years, ideally someone else would be taking that role. Sure, maybe Russ could help you win a game here or there when both of these two were missing, but what about when they are there? Is he going to make you lose when you actually have your 2 best players? Are you trying to build your roster around injury contingencies? I'm not saying that they are important, but they can't be the reason you make a franchise-altering decision. The Lakers had won a title just 2 years prior with shooters and perimeter defenders surrounding LeBron and AD, and they traded them all away or let them walk in free agency just so they could pay Russell Westbrook $44 million a year to be one of the worst starters in the NBA. But then we get to the teams that inspired this video. If you know me, you know why I have some thoughts on these 2 teams in particular, more specifically about the leader of these 2 teams. Let's start with the one that's harder to be critical of. While I have my criticisms from a franchise point of view, I understand why the 2020 Nets went the direction they did. They were still recovering from the disaster that was the Pierce and KG trade, so when they were told that Kevin Durant and Kyrie Irving, and I guess DeAndre Jordan as well, wanted to come to town, how do you not say, yes, please sign here? Unfortunately, it went beyond just signing them. Brooklyn essentially surrendered the franchise to these 2 players, which is just simply not something you should do. The year before these 2 joined the Nets, they managed to make the playoffs, having built a team through trades and free agency, given they couldn't do it in the draft from their last Hail Mary of a failed super team. The reason for this was the culture Brooklyn had established, which was primarily thanks to their head coach Kenny Atkinson. This, as well as 2 max spots, made Brooklyn a fairly attractive destination, which made it extremely confusing to me that KD then proceeded to force Atkinson out in favor of his own lackey in Steve Nash. Steve Nash, wow, a lot of repeat characters in this one. Rather than a coach who established a winning and fun culture, instead they wanted a yes man who would do and say as they pleased, more of a puppet than an actual coach. There was also an attractive core of role players who KD then forced out as well, first by having DeAndre Jordan start over Jared Allen despite clearly being a worse player, and then by pushing for the franchise to trade all of its assets for James Harden. Now, a lot of people like to point out injury as a reason this trade is still justified. You can't criticize that trade. They could have gone far if Harden and Kyrie didn't get hurt. Oh boy, here we go again with the fucking should'ves. I'm not gonna go down that whole rabbit hole again, because I've already done it before. So here's the thing. I actually can criticize that trade specifically because of the injuries. You know what's a whole lot more helpful for winning a close playoff series than an injured James Harden? A bunch of good role players. Because if one of those players gets hurt, guess what? There's still other guys who can step up. The Nets put all of their eggs into one basket and then said, you can't criticize us for putting all of our eggs into one basket because then all of the eggs broke. Are you fucking dumb? Are you stupid? Are you a dimwit? Are you a fucking knucklehead? The second round series versus Milwaukee in 2021 was extremely close. Game 7 went into overtime, where KD went 0 for 6 by the way. That's a slim margin to lose by. If they had Karis LeVert, Taurean Prince, and Jared Allen, or just even one of those 3, it probably would have swung the series the other way. But no, KD wanted to play God and found out that he's just a disciple. But don't worry, he's gonna keep playing. After this disaster blows up and the Nets are once again left pickless, starless, and destitute, KD then moves on to the Phoenix Suns to play alongside Devin Booker and CP3, except turns out CP3 is washed for real this time. And as it turns out, the wing depth of McCall and Cam Johnson made the Suns the team that they were. the team that made it all the way to the finals in 2021. But now the Suns had become the Booker and KD ISO show. No longer a team, instead a duo. A duo of players who do the same fucking things, not a complementary skill to be found between them.
You think this is bad? This chicanery? He's done worse.
Then, as per usual, KD ensures the roster gets gutted, encourages them to trade for an aging Bradley Beal who's showing clear signs of decline, but oh, don't worry, at least he only makes $50 million a year. Now, the Suns don't become a failed super team until after the Beal trade. That's when they started getting super team hype. They were tied with the Bucks for the third best championship odds going into the season. Okay, don't die laughing as soon as I say this line. Now, not to jork my own peentus, but fuck. But not to jork on my own peentus too much, but I called this team being a shit show from the start, so please allow me to run my quick victory lap. These fucking morons thought that spending $150 million per year for 3 players who all do the same thing would be a good idea.
What a sick joke!
All of that cap being locked up for 3 players, they had to trade for small contracts and sign mid-level role players to the minimum. And even doing about as good of a job as you can under those circumstances, the Suns still fell hilariously short. All year long I called this team fraudulent, and then they go to round 1 and everyone favored them versus Minnesota, and they got fucking embarrassed. It's okay, KD. Keep playing God if you want, and I'll sit back and watch as the wooden pole of a rake hits you in the head over and over and over again as you choose to step on it. Because at the end of the day, as much criticism as there may be, to most NBA fans, none of this will ever eclipse your greatest sin.
He defecated through a sunroof.
What? No, Charles, I'm talking about the Warriors thing. What the fuck's wrong with you?
I am not crazy!
Yeah, okay, sure, pal. Don't let the gas lamp hit you on the way out. Anyways, though there were many specific reasons for the downfall of many of these teams, there's a few common through lines here that illustrate why they failed. And hopefully in the future we can use them to see the warning signs for a disaster like this, so at the very least, people can avoid getting their hopes up. There's a lot of symptoms of the disease which led to the inevitable death of nearly all ringless super teams. The most prominent one being prioritizing name recognition. Basically, every failed super team invested too much into players who had a big name, betting on notoriously talented players when assembling their rosters, but more often than not, it's a bad gamble, where they don't account for how those big names actually fit together, or how those big names might not actually live up to expectations, especially if they're in a new environment. Just about every failed super team made a bad bet on something like trading all of their future draft capital for declining stars in their 30s just because they were named Paul Pierce and Kevin Garnett, for example. In the case of those Nets, super teams failing wasn't all too common to this point. NBA teams were still stuck trying to compete in a league still living in the wake of the first modern Big Three in Boston, as well as the splash of LeBron's decision to make a Big Three in Miami. So it's not like everyone saw the writing on the wall.
Hey, did you guys hear that the Celtics traded their 2 best players in the last 20 years for 3 meaningless draft picks and one of the worst contracts in the league?
Now, this wasn't a mistake in terms of fit as it relates to name recognition. Rather, it was thinking that just because those guys were still some of the most recognizable major names in the league, that they were also still major needle movers and would be for years to come despite their old age. This starting five was just too damn old. And honestly, from a fit perspective, if this roster was front to back all of these dudes in their primes, then it would have been quite a deadly team. Darren Williams, Joe Johnson, Paul Pierce, Kevin Garnett, and Brook Lopez is a hell of a starting lineup. If you want name recognition, that lineup definitely has it. But unfortunately, Pierce, KG, and Williams weren't nearly as good as they were at their peaks, and that issue would only become worse with time. The cause of this illness that made the Nets reach blindly for these big names, in this case, was new ownership. Mikhail Dmitrievich Prokhorov had just become a majority owner of the Brooklyn Nets, and the Nets had just moved to Brooklyn. So the hope was that this new roster would put the Nets in the conversation for being the best team in the NBA, one that could legitimately compete with the Big Three Miami Heat. That was, of course, a joke, because the Nets were too damn old. And Mikhail Dmitrievich Prokhorov paid for this joke, as did the Brooklyn Nets franchise for years to come. If we look at the case of the 2022 Los Angeles Lakers, symptoms started showing when they traded for Russell Westbrook. This trade, unlike the KG and Pierce one, was disastrous from a fit perspective. Russ is statistically the worst high-volume three-point shooter in NBA history. Nobody does it worse than Russ does it. So predictably, this team was a disaster in terms of pure three-point numbers, but on top of that, they were terrible in the paint. Because while yes, Russ is really good at putting pressure on the rim, he didn't have the adequate spacing around him when he had the ball. And when he didn't have the ball, he was fucking up the spacing more than anybody. And of course, you don't want Russ to have the ball at all times because you have LeBron on the roster, who's pretty high up on the list of players who you want to have the ball in their hands for large percentages of the game. So this was a horrid fit across the board. So bad that LA could have done nothing and it would have been better than this move. But that brings me to another symptom of the failed super team. Players playing GM. This Russell Westbrook move was signed off on by LeBron, and LeBron is inarguably a basketball genius on some level, but even he was blinded by name recognition and not seeing the poor fit. You would think LeBron, being as smart as he is about basketball, would recognize how awful of a fit Westbrook would be, but I guess not. When super teams are formed via players conspiring together to get it done, rather than it coming from the will of the franchise, the results aren't usually the best. The Big Three Miami Heat might be the only exception to this, but they made their fit work and adapted over time. Let's look at another team where this symptom of players playing GM is more prominent. When KD and Kyrie teamed up on the 2020 Nets, both of these guys were players with some kind of chip on their shoulder. They were also boys, which is why they also ensured their boy DeAndre Jordan got himself a hefty contract. They could have easily signed someone who actually could have contributed to the team, but KD and Kyrie were too focused on getting another big name who was their buddy, sacrificing the actual basketball needs of the team. This led to DeAndre taking up valuable playing time from Jarrett Allen, who was really set to be this team's third best player, coming into his fourth season at age 22 off of 2 straight seasons starting for Brooklyn and even getting some votes for DPOY both years. Had DJ not been there, it would have allowed Allen to shine as a Net, but instead he got thrown into another huge gamble of a trade when the Nets made the deal for James Harden, likely with the approval of KD and Kyrie. I'm personally of the opinion that Jarrett Allen would have been a better third star for these two than Harden, even though James was clearly the better player, and DeAndre Jordan would have been relegated to being overpaid to play 18 minutes a game, I guess. Players playing GM often comes paired with another symptom: ego. For the Nets, it manifested by Kyrie Irving having some, let's call it, personal issues. James Harden did not like the way it was handled, and this eventually led to the entire team falling apart. First, with Brooklyn trading away Harden and trying to make the Ben Simmons thing work, and then the death blow to this alleged super team was when Kyrie Irving and Kevin Durant both bailed at the 2023 trade deadline mid-season. The 04 Lakers would make for another good example of how ego can be the deadly symptom of a dying super team. Star NBA players generally tend to bring with themselves a lot of personality, or baggage even if it's really bad, and these personalities can come to clash. Drake and Kobe had pretty significant beef, and I don't have to tell you the extent of Kobe's beef with Shaq. So in the 2004 finals, Kobe shot the team out of the series because he didn't trust his teammates and he was pushing for the finals MVP. All of that is ego, and it destroyed a team that should have worked on paper. The 90s Houston Rockets with Hakeem, Pippen, and Barkley also saw some egos clashing.
And for him to want to leave after 1 year just disappointed me greatly.
I wouldn't get Charles Barkley an apology at gunpoint, so he could never expect an apology from me. If anything, he owed me an apology for coming and play with his sorry fat butt.
Putting together a roster of big names comes with big consequences. Each member of any big three has spent their career with a certain amount of responsibilities, and you need to have a good idea of how those players might react to change. If it goes right, you can get something like Chris Bosh, my Pookie Bear, who has no qualms about the idea of a reduced role. He happily shot the ball less while focusing his energy on impacting the game in other ways, primarily defensively. But if it goes wrong, you get something like Carmelo Anthony in OKC, being unwilling to adjust his game to his new environment, unwilling to sacrifice anything about his game to the detriment of the team. Just because a player was good in one context doesn't mean they will be good in another. The end result of that is having a player whose value dramatically reduces upon this realization, but because they were likely valued contractually as though they were their old self, they're just someone who is dramatically overpaid, so you can't move them for a very valuable return. One of the better tests for how unselfish a star player can be is seeing them traded to a team with another star. Some pass this test, others fail. It's a gamble, but sometimes franchises make a really stupid gamble that's obviously not going to work, and it shoots them in the foot, getting stuck with a bunch of names that look great on paper, but not on a basketball court. These franchises often also make these gambles with no regard for what comes after. Sure, let's trade for Bradley Beal's $50 million contract. I'm sure that will come with zero consequences for our future. Yeah, let's trade multiple role players for Russell Westbrook's also damn near $50 million contract. Oh, I know, let's trade all of our draft capital for some mid-30s big three who peaked years ago. If you invest this much in just a few names, it leaves you with little to invest in everyone beyond your quote-unquote big three. A common thread with the failed super teams we saw springing up most prominently in the last 10 years or so is that these rosters are thrown together haphazardly, with no notion of continuity and no notion of the moves that follow the big one. Smart franchises with good management and basketball ideals are willing to make big trades. Big trades aren't inherently a bad idea by any stretch, but they do require proceeding with caution and keeping other moves in mind. When LA traded for Anthony Davis in 2019, they still had KCP and Kyle Kuzma on the roster after the fact, plus an up-and-coming Alex Caruso who ended up breaking out the first season with AD there. And on top of that, they signed Danny Green in free agency, who just made major contributions to the championship Toronto Raptors. The Big Three Heat, after putting together the initial roster, didn't do a ton to help them in year one, but they would soon sign Shane Battier and eventually Ray Allen, who were both very key contributors for Miami, pieces that had they not added them to the roster, it might have doomed the team to never win a title, as Battier at the 3 with LeBron and Bosh sliding down to the 4 and 5 was the key move that unlocked this roster, which allowed them to win in the 2012 finals, and I don't need to explain Ray Allen's value to their 2013 title. The roster beyond the big names has always mattered, but how much they matter has only gone up in recent years. That's one of the main causes of failed super team disease. The value of star power isn't the same as it was a decade ago or a decade before that. Cool, you traded for a star player. Now what are you going to do about the supporting cast? Because unlike 2008, you can't get away with a mid-supporting cast anymore. There hasn't been a championship team with a weak bench unit or a mediocre starter or two since, well, the KD Golden State Warriors. What these players who team up, or managers making a trade to save their job, or new owner trying to make a big splash with their new franchise aren't getting is that in this sport, while being superstar focused in its culture, the NBA isn't actually a superstars league. There are 5 players in any given lineup, and while having 3 guys who are really fucking talented is quite tempting, the remaining 2 players, and even those that you sub in, are far more important than that talent when you add in the context of how the big 3 actually plays together, how the rest of the team fits with that big 3, all of these sort of detailed nuances that are a lot harder to recognize than a big name, play a much larger part in preventing a super team from dying ringless than those names ever will. Again, the Phoenix Suns currently have 3 players making $50+ million a year annually, which means the rest of the money on that team can only be spent in very small amounts that must be distributed amongst multiple players. That means you're only getting the lower tier players in terms of their value. You can maybe find a diamond in the rough here or there. Tyus Jones, I love you, my sweet baby boy. But it's best not to put yourself in a position where you have to bet on Tyus Jones being your 4th best player. The irony of making a big-ass gamble like this is it leads you to taking even further gambles to try and compensate for your losses. But when you get stuck with a $50 million check with a no-trade clause for a player who is arguably not even a top 50 player in the league, and no one wants to foot that bill, well, then you're capital F fucked, leading to a roster with 3 major names at the top of it and a whole bunch of mostly nothing below it. But let me get out of my KD hater bag for just a second. Just a second. The last symptom that you will often see with a failed super team is the scapegoat head coach. Looking at a lot of the coaches for these failed super teams, more often than not, they are guys in way over their heads, usually meant to be a puppet for the franchise superstars exhibiting players playing GM. Now, a part of this, much of this, is to blame on the ego-born hubris of these superstars, thinking they and their star player buddies are so good that they can circumvent the value of coaching and a good system. Kevin Durant famously complained about the system the Warriors ran, even though it was the very system that gave them their success in the first place. See, I told you it would be just a second. I'm gonna keep using KD as an example because he always makes for a perfect one when talking about failure in the realm of super teams. After Golden State, he went to the Nets and the Suns and didn't really have a system and was surprised to learn that iso ball every possession didn't get the job done. Whether it be the 2024 Phoenix Suns, the 2020s Brooklyn Nets, the 2013 or 2022 Lakers, or even the 2018 Thunder, they all had no good system. It was all about going for overbearing, top-level talent with no regard for fit and with no plan for how to utilize that talent. They thought the big names they added to the roster was enough to circumvent being an actual NBA franchise. So when a coach can't figure out how to make an incompatible team somehow compatible just because they have so much talent at their disposal, they're made out to be the villain instead of all the other bad pieces to this broken machine. But not to give them a complete pass, it still is on head coaches at the end of the day to do their job, and very rarely are they actually doing it when they're only there as a prop to be blamed when it doesn't go well. Steve Nash was out of a job just 7 games into his 3rd year in Brooklyn. Darvin Ham was being rumored to be fired after about 1.5 seasons before leaving in LA after 2. Frank Vogel was out after 1 year in Phoenix. Hell, even the Bucks fired Adrian Griffin just partially into his first year after their first chunk of the season didn't go well despite Damian Lillard being added to the roster. A scapegoat head coach can be a dead giveaway that a super team is on the way to its end. Okay, now that I've gone over all of these symptoms, I want you to please bear in mind that I am not criticizing these franchises for taking big swings. Some risk-taking is inherent with making any decision, and with running a sports team, it's kind of what it's all about. Believe me, I'll be the first to tell you that a franchise that doesn't ever take a risk is far worse. That's what gets you accepting mediocrity, happy to live forever in NBA purgatory, destined for irrelevance. But you have to be smart with your gambles. Don't enter the casino and just immediately put all your chips on black, because you might devastate your franchise with just one move. These failed super teams of the recent past consistently dug themselves into such deep holes that their only way out was to blow everything up. And these teams will tell you after the fact that it was worth the risk. But was it? Look at the Brooklyn Nets. Pre the KD and Kyrie signing, they just had their best year in a while. They built their franchise up organically and made something worth being proud of. And on top of that, their draft capital was just around the corner from being theirs again. Then they added KD and Kyrie and were coerced into trading all of their future draft capital yet again for James Harden, just for all three to leave them in the dust, back to square one of being a dogshit franchise, with the only consolation prize being Mikal Bridges and a competitive second-round exit. They spent the last year and a half in perpetual mediocrity. Luckily, they've steered in the right direction with moving on from Mikal Bridges and getting back some of their own draft capital, but they're still far from the end of their path to a full recovery. And as sad as it can seem, it's kind of funny really. When super teams first really came into popular NBA culture with the Big Three Celtics, forming a super team was a sign of a really smart and competent franchise. But now, just 15 years later, it's a sign of an incompetent one. Super teams just don't really work anymore from a logistical standpoint. And those franchises that seem to be blind to that fact look stupid and incompetent instead of the opposite. The NBA is changing, or rather, has changed. The landscape that made making a super team make some sense is a thing of the past. The current landscape of the NBA heavily values fit over talent, which is something that these modern failed super teams aren't properly considering in lieu of just big names. But what changed? How did we even get here?
Wojnarowski reporting Steph Curry has agreed to a 4-year, $215 million extension.
Congratulations to Giannis. He will sign a 5-year, $228 million Supermax extension.
Gobert signed a contract extension that will make him the highest paid center in NBA history. The extension is a 5-year deal worth $205 million.
Russell Westbrook has agreed to a 5-year, $205 million contract extension.
Bradley Beal just agreed to a max contract with the Washington Wizards. The deal is a 5-year deal, $251 million max contract. Cha-ching.
The Supermax's inception came on the heels of Kevin Durant's departure from the OKC Thunder during the 2016 offseason. The move sent shockwaves around the league and left team owners terrified of the prospect of losing their best players in a similar fashion. And NBA Commissioner Adam Silver, who had only assumed his position a couple of years prior, responded that same summer. Quote, "Just to be absolutely clear, I do not think that's ideal from the league's standpoint." Unquote. Fortunately for him, the NBA's collective bargaining agreement with its players was set to expire. So in 2017, just 1 year after KD formed the super team to end all super teams, the designated veteran player extension, the official name of the Supermax, was implemented into the NBA. But while the Supermax was colloquially called the Kevin Durant rule early on in its lifespan, the truth is, Kevin Durant taking the hardest road by taking his talents to Golden State was merely the straw that broke the camel's back. It's a pretty big fucking straw. The Supermax was implemented with the goal of slowing down the superstar player movement around the league. With LeBron's infamous The Decision, Chris Paul's departure from the Hornets, and even Kevin Love's departure from Minnesota, the NBA figured that the best way to keep players on the teams that drafted them was to make it so that only their current team could offer the most amount of money possible. Money talks, and if the amount of money that the player's original team could offer was significantly more than what others could, then surely it would keep stars from seeking greener pastures, right? Well, here's how the Supermax works. It requires that the player must be entering their 8th or 9th season in the NBA, and additionally, they must have either made an All-NBA team in either the season immediately before signing the extension or 2 of the 3 previous seasons. Another way is being named the Defensive Player of the Year in either the season immediately before signing the extension or 2 of the 3 previous seasons, or having been named NBA's MVP at least once in the previous 3 seasons. There's also one more caveat. The team offering the extension must have originally drafted the player or obtained him in a trade while that player was on his rookie contract. And for the NBA players who meet those requirements, then congratulations, they're able to get a Supermax contract offer from their team that's worth between 30 and 35% of the salary cap, rather than the mere 25% for the standard max extension. On top of that, while free agents can only sign 4-year deals when switching teams, a player's original team can re-sign their talent for an additional 5th year, but these guys don't even need to hit free agency because their current team can negotiate an extension a year or 2 before the player's current contract even expires. It's really set up to where if a team wants to keep their guy, they pretty much always can. Now, the Supermax has had a few consequences that aren't the most favorable. Guys getting contracts that really don't make much sense for anyone beyond a small market franchise that is desperate to keep whatever star talent around that they can. No team in the league was willing to give Rudy Gobert or Bradley Beal the kind of money Utah or Washington would end up giving them, not just because they literally couldn't thanks to the Supermax, but also frankly because they wouldn't want to. You gotta be a really, and I mean really special player for a franchise to be willing to pay you that kind of money, or you have to be a really, and I mean really special player to that franchise, either from the legend status within the franchise or just from outright desperation. And even then, some desperate teams don't want to pony up the dough. Just ask the Sacramento Kings. They traded DeMarcus Cousins to the New Orleans Pelicans because they were entirely uninterested in offering him the 5-year, $209 million that he was eligible for. But as bad as some of these extensions can look in retrospect, the goal was a league where superstars stayed with the teams that drafted them, and that's exactly the league that we got. After just about any star player is done with their rookie deal, they're going to sign back with their original team via restricted free agency, where the original team has the right to match anybody else's offer. And then after that second contract is up, unless things have gone horribly wrong in the first 9 years with the franchise, there shouldn't be much of a reason to leave, or at least not one with more incentives than just taking the Supermax. Not only that, but for the players who do end up wanting to leave, they don't do it by just leaving in free agency. Leaving in free agency is so 2010. It was really cool and even vintage when Paul George this offseason just signed with the Sixers. Wild stuff. But typically speaking, players are moving via trade, or at least sign-in trades where the original team gets something in a case where they'd otherwise get nothing. Teams seldom have a max slot of salary available, so they need to move other contracts in the same move to bring on a larger contract player. So because just about every homegrown star player is signing the Supermax as soon as it's offered, If a team is going to trade for a player, it will need to be later into that contract's term instead of a sign-and trade. One way or the other, the cost of a star player is a lot more than it once was. Look at how the recent failed super teams in the era have been formed. It's almost been exclusively via trade. So rather than only losing cap space in free agency, teams usually would lose draft capital and young talent as well. The Suns traded for KD and Beal, the Nets traded for Harden, the Lakers traded for Russ, traded for AD before that. The Thunder traded for Melo and Paul George, the Nets traded for KG and Pierce. The Supermax puts a huge wrench into assembling these God squads because star players do not want to take less money pretty much always. But it doesn't stop with just the Supermax. What about the actual basketball being played? What are the causes of death for the Superteam era that actually pertain to what happens on the hardwood? Well, to put it simply, the power of Superteams has been lessened because the power of superstars has been lessened. Superteams are pretty much always top-heavy. That's their whole thing. I mentioned in Chapter 1 that of the divulging paths after 2 superstars, either a 3rd star tier player or a cast of great role players, most go with the 3rd star approach. And frankly, that's a huge mistake. Getting 2 superstars on your roster with the financial restrictions of today's NBA is already a Herculean task on its own. Don't make your situation worse by putting everything else you have into another star player. It doesn't work because top-heavy teams no longer work. Again, looking at the past few NBA champions, they are all rosters who top to bottom have some S-tier role players. The 2024 Celtics are the perfect example of this. And really, for how perfect they almost are the modern idea of a super team because they have a super role player squad. Guys who all do similar things really well, while none of them stand out super hard as individuals, leading to a debatable Finals MVP campaign, but a title at the end of the day which matters above all. The hyperinflation of talent in the NBA is something we've discussed, so I'll try not to harp on it too much, but the talent in the NBA is as inflated as it has ever been, and that will really only continue to be the case with time. However, the top 10 or so players in the NBA aren't actually like leaps and bounds better than the top 10 players of previous eras. The top of the totem pole has gone relatively unchanged, but the lower end of the totem pole, the 11th through 50th best players in the league, have gotten so much better. And because the totem pole is more balanced, those at the top overall just have less influence on the result of things. The game of basketball is more balanced now because of this influx of great role players. A big 3 doesn't stand a chance versus a sexy 6. Due to the impact of role players increasing so much, teams that throw their value to the side for some major name making 50 M's a year are seeing that gamble leave them empty-handed time and time again. It is instead the teams who are invested in these high-tier role players who are actually getting championships out of the exchange. The NBA in 2024 has a surplus of talent and a shortage of fit, so the value of these things reflects that. That's a whole lot different from the NBA that I grew up with, where it wouldn't matter if your 6th, 7th, or 8th man sucked, or even if you had a kind of weak starter. You could still win a championship if you had 2 or 3 top-of-the-line NBA players. The battle for the best team in the league doesn't start at the top anymore. Obviously, you still need to check that superstar box, but it is no longer the only box that needs checking. NBA teams that are failing to come to this realization are living in the past, thinking you can trade for a bunch of stars totaling $150 million a year combined, and then just figuring out players 4 through 9. It's not how we do things anymore. It's just not. You are far, better off in the modern NBA with one superstar and a great cast of role players, or two superstars and a good cast of role players, than you are with three superstars and a dog shit cast of role players. And given that the last one is more or less the general structure of a super team, well, it's no wonder why these teams keep failing. The actual basketball talent has moved the needle in response to these super teams. Anyone can beat anyone now. It's often up entirely to the whims of guys who aren't even top 50 players in the league. You can be the 11th best player in a series and still swing the whole fucking thing on your own with just one big game. That power transitioning to the lower class of talent in the NBA takes that power away from superstars. It's more evenly distributed among the rest of the league, you know, to each according to their need type beat. Communism, baby. We're spreading the wealth. And I do mean that literally, as we are now paying these role players more and more each year, which means less money for further max contracts being added to the payroll. So nowadays, superstars cost way more, you pretty much always have to trade for them, and they're less likely to want to leave for your franchise because they have less incentives to leave the franchise that drafted them now. And then finally, there's the risk factor of it all, which has proven to be a huge part of why some of these super teams have failed. Luck, especially when it comes to the health of your best players, almost always determines whether or not you have a chance at winning a championship, super team or otherwise. And that risk only goes up when you're invested in fewer important players. Look at maybe the last attempt at forming a super team that came at least half from free agency, the 2019 through 2024 LA Clippers. Kawhi Leonard broke every expectation possible in the span of like a year and a half, from asking out of San Antonio to being traded to what was basically the opposite of his preferred destination, winning a championship despite that, and then leaving for his original preferred destination anyways. Kawhi's Machiavellian approach to player movement has its own place as a truly unique micro-era in NBA history, but rather than going too hard on it in this video, we'll just strictly state some facts about the NBA's most recent collapsed super team. Between Kawhi Leonard and Paul George arriving in LA in 2019 and George's departure in 2024, the Clippers played a total of 433 games, including the playoffs. But of those 433, they only shared the floor for less than half of them. Just 207 total games. They played together in the playoffs in year one, but Paul George was on a bad hammy. In year two's playoffs, they found themselves tied 2-2 in round two, then Kawhi Leonard went down, but Paul George managed to carry the Clippers in his absence to drag LA to its first ever conference finals appearance in the team's 50-plus year history, before being eliminated by the Chris Paul Suns. Year 3 saw no Kawhi all season, and PG only played 31 games, so naturally they missed the playoffs. Year 4 only had 52 games of Kawhi and 56 games of Paul George, 38 of which where they actually overlapped, so still over half of the 2022 season was without their duo, but despite this, they managed to make the playoffs just to be without George due to another leg injury, and for Kawhi to only appear in 2 out of their 5 games versus the Suns. And then finally, year 5 comes around, Kawhi signs a contract extension in January, but Paul George doesn't. They both play a vast majority of the season, playing 63 games together. Health finally seems like it's giving the Clippers a chance, and then Kawhi gets hurt in April, and the season ends with another first-round exit. Leonard tried to play hurt for a couple of games, but it did not end up mattering. This squad might have been doomed from the very start, as it was assembled at the peak of their superstars' powers, and that meant that they were only together for their declines. Super teams in the 2020s, like the Clippers, have been married to these older injury risk players and it's very 90s Rockets-esque. So if superstars are more expensive, harder to acquire, and more risky investments than ever, and you add on to it that their level of impact has decreased due to what I guess you could call role player inflation, well, it seems like even trying to form a super team looks damn near impossible, let alone actually succeeding as one. Pursuing a super team in the 2020s is a fruitless venture, and NBA franchises that are still trying to do it are living in the past. At least, I think. I can't say I'm 100% sure that super teams are officially dead and buried. The pulse is somehow still there despite all other signs indicating that this era is over. It's evident that they aren't doing so hot in recent years because, I'll remind you, there hasn't been a title team you could accurately call a super team since 2018, at least by my definition, of course. But something like Jalen Brunson signing for less money than he could have gives me pause. Not that I'm expecting that to become anything resembling the norm going forward, but with Supermax money reaching the ridiculous levels that it is, I gotta wonder if players could plausibly start to see it as excessive. If you get together just even 2 of these guys with like minds, we could see the formation of a super team. That possibility exists. That said, I don't have much faith we will see a genuinely successful, undeniable super team anytime in the near future. It will have to come with some major changes to the landscape of the NBA, and that doesn't really happen overnight. At least, not anymore. More likely than the goal of super teams being met anytime soon is that instead the goalpost will move, and super teams will be more about super fit than super talent. The real reason people even started asking questions about whether or not the Celtics were a super team in the first place wasn't just because Jaylen Brown is pretty damn good, it was also because besides for their top 2 guys, the next 4 dudes on the team were all also awesome in their own way while being super compatible on top of it, maximizing each other's talents and meshing about as well as possible. If the 2024 C's are truly a super team, then it's by an almost entirely new definition that doesn't match mine or even Wikipedia's. So maybe the super team era isn't dead, it's just evolved. If you have made it this far, thank you so much for watching this video. It is much appreciated. We spent a ton of time on it, and if you dedicate this amount of your time to our work, then we, well, really appreciate it. If you want to support this work further, we have a Patreon that will be linked in the description. We have a Discord server that we all communicate on if you want to talk basketball with some like-minded people. We also release chapters early. We edit these things in chapters so you can get the content early. A lot of people watch these in parts, so it's kind of that ordeal. You guys can also participate in the discussion of what we're even doing with these videos. But as I always say, because I don't expect anything, if you're just watching, that's all I need, man. Thanks so much. I'm out.